In Nazi concentration camps during the Second World War, prisoners were subjected to horrific torture. They were subjected to severe psychological abuse. They had to perform grueling labor. Legally, prisoners had no protection. They were provided with the minimum necessities of life. Concentration camp hostages could not cope with their circumstances and were forced to obey the camp authorities, and they were brutally abused. But in addition to the above-mentioned horrors, the prisoners had to participate in horrifying experiments without voluntary consent. In the concentration camps, research was conducted, which was aimed at creating the greatest army in the world. Scientific hypotheses were tested with human material and biomedical technologies were mastered. Terrifying cruelty was shown not only by German soldiers, but also by doctors. One such executioner was Sigmund Rascher. He was a doctor at the Luftwaffe Research Institute. To the German command, he proposed various experiments that would improve the fighting ability of soldiers. For these purposes, he was allocated separate blocks, where Rascher practiced all his conclusions on prisoners. One of his studies was to investigate the process of freezing in humans under normal conditions. These experiments were necessary to understand how the body protects itself from cold and how to develop a tolerance to cold weather. In addition, Rascher was interested in ethnic predisposition to easily tolerate cold temperatures, and many more theoretical questions were on the agenda. Research in this direction followed two paths. On the one hand, human freezing was studied, and the conditions under which death from cold occurs. The second way was to study ways to help warm frozen people. Experiments to study natural freezing began in September 1942. Concentration camp inmates were chosen as test subjects. They were dressed in overalls worn by military pilots, as well as in life jackets with different designs. Electric thermometers were inserted into the stomach and rectum with a probe. These were necessary to record body temperature under different conditions. After the temperature in the internal organs was measured, the subjects were placed in a pool of cold water. The effect of the cold substance on the subjects wearing different waistcoats was tested. Some wore waistcoats that fixed the head and neck below the water level, while others wore similar waistcoats, but the head and neck were fixed above the water level. The water temperature in the pools ranged from 2.5 to 12 degrees Celsius. The victims placed in such conditions were in terrible agony. After about an hour, they were already semi-conscious and stopped screaming. As a result of these experiments, all the subjects who wore waistcoats that fixed their heads and necks below the water level died. Rascher's reports recorded that in those who died, a large mass of blood accumulated in the cranial cavity and the right ventricle of the heart was maximally dilated. As soon as the temperature of the subjects reached 28 degrees, they died, and all efforts to bring them back to life were in vain. As a result of cruel experiments, it was found out that it is important to heat the head and protect the neck of the pilot. This allowed German engineers to develop a protective cover, all that protected the pilot's body well. The development did prove useful, but that was the way it was achieved. But Rascher didn't stop there. He needed to understand the process of cooling the human body and the nuances of cold death. Other methods were used in this direction. People were deliberately frozen. Some were thrown out unclothed on cold nights into a special exercise yard. Some were sprinkled with cold water while they were tied to stretchers. Others were placed in the same cold pool, but without protective suits. Ethnic Russians were most often selected for the monstrous experiments because they were familiar with the cold and could bear it more easily, and they were racially close to Germans. Both men and women were taken as test subjects. First, they were fed well so that their physical performance reached normal levels. That's the only way to get the right results. Those who were driven out into the snow spent many hours outdoors without clothes. They were allowed to move and warm themselves in any way possible, but people still froze. Eyewitnesses recalled that they screamed terribly. Even the Dachau guards could not endure these screams. The concentration camp executioners suggested that Rascher eliminate the noise, because the screams had a negative effect on the emotional state of the guards. Afterwards, people who had frozen to a critical state were warmed in various ways. To bring some people back to life, various heating devices were used. Others were warmed with animal heat, i.e., the human body. Women were specially brought from other concentration camps for this purpose. They had to cling tightly to the frostbitten. In general, they had to do everything possible to induce the frozen person to intimate intimacy. As a result of temperature measurement, the experimenters concluded that heating with heating devices and animal heat did not make much difference. The process of temperature rise occurred at approximately equal rates. Only those frostbitten people who had the strength to make intimate contact with the proposed women were heated faster. Most often, it turned out when one man and one woman participated in the experiment. If there were two women, the result was not as effective. Perhaps because the women did not feel as liberated as they did when alone with a man. They also studied the possibilities of hardening the body. Also on prisoners. Some were forced to douse themselves with cold water. Others were forced to work outside without clothes, and others were forced to live in unheated rooms. Eyewitnesses recalled that they screamed terribly. Even the Dachau guards could not endure these screams. The concentration camp executioner suggested that Rascher eliminate the noise, because the screams had a negative effect on the emotional state of the guards. Afterwards, people who had frozen to a critical state were warmed in various ways. To bring some people back to life, various heating devices were used. Others were warmed with animal heat, i.e., the human body. Women were specially brought from other concentration camps for this purpose. They had to cling tightly to the frostbitten, but even those who managed to keep warm were not saved. Some went insane from the experiments that were conducted on them. Others, as a result of loss of consciousness, got serious functional disorders. And again, no one was going to treat these disorders. Over time, such people died anyway. Those who proved to be the most resilient and suffered minimal physical and mental damage were not excluded from the test group. They were forced to take part in other Rascher experiments. If even by some miracle a person managed to survive Rascher's experiments, he was then destroyed by the camp guards. Nobody wanted witnesses. The Nazis were well aware that despite the great ideas for which they acted, they were still war criminals, and sooner or later they would have to be punished. While they mocked others, they themselves were afraid to take responsibility for their actions. So, they destroyed as many witnesses as possible, so that there would be as little compromising material as possible. But the fate of Dr. Palach himself was not cloudless either. He was accused of betraying the trust of the party and the German people. Rascher announced brilliant discoveries in the field of gynecology. Allegedly, his wife of 48 years was able to give birth to a healthy child and then gave birth to 2 more babies. But it all turned out to be untrue. In reality, Rascher simply took those babies born in the camp and passed them off as his own children. The career of the brutal test pilot ended in May 1944. Ironically, he himself turned out to be a prisoner of the Dachau camp. He was placed in a special bunker where especially dangerous and important criminals were kept. Rascher's wife was sent to another concentration camp. At the end of World War II, they both died. Not much information about the activities of this terrible experimenter has been preserved. But even the facts that do exist make people who have seen a lot of things shudder. It's not clear where the Nazis got such cruelty. But one thing is clear. This is not human behavior, and it must not happen again.